Health, Psychology and Human Nature with André Sturesson. Hey friends, hope you're having a great day. Are you following me on Instagram and Facebook? Please go to Health, Psychology and Human Nature on Instagram or Facebook, or both for that matter, to get the latest episodes, inspiration and more. Please take a pause and go there. Also, if you like the episode, please share it with a friend, family member, or somebody else who you think might like it. Welcome back, friends, to another episode of Health, Psychology and Human Nature with André Sturesson, a science-focused podcast where we explore, learn, and improve our lives together. In today's fascinating episode, I talk with Professor Bobby Duffy, who explains why we are wrong about a lot of things, like the murder rate and the amount of teenage moms that we have in our countries. We also talk about fascinating concepts like emotional innumeracy, confirmation bias, rosy, retrospection, and other biases. And we also get into the dangers of not having a balanced view of the current state of our countries and the world. To learn more, read Bobby's book, Why We're Wrong About Nearly Everything, A Theory of Human Misunderstanding. Bobby is a professor of public policy and director of the Policy Institute. Prior to joining King's in 2018, Bobby was the managing director of public affairs for Ipsos MORI, which is a team of around 250 researchers in London, Manchester, Edinburgh, and Brussels, and global director of the Ipsos Social Research Institute across around 30 countries. Friends, please enjoy today's episode. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's been. I've been looking at your book, and I think it's a fascinating subject. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation with you.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, it's great. So this is about, or one of the big things here is about us being wrong about a lot of stuff. So have you become immune to being wrong, or how has this affected you personally?
That's a really good question. So I talk a bit in the book about how Daniel Kahneman, obviously the godfather of lots of our understanding of our biases and heuristics, our mental shortcuts, he was asked a similar question, and he said he's been studying these effects for 45 years and he hasn't improved one bit. and I kind of feel, well, in some ways, to be honest, I don't want to, it sounds like I saying I'm more successful than Daniel Kahneman in understanding these things, but you do, on this very specific issue of people estimating social and political realities incorrectly, you do actually get better at guessing how wrong other people are going to be on particular things. Doesn't mean to say that I get them right. I definitely don't get them right, but you start to understand the nature of our biases and the directions they tend to push us in. So we always do have a bit of a guess before we do the surveys of what we think the general public in whichever country, what the average answer is going to be. And you do get better at that over time. And it's partly just because you start to understand the effects, why we overestimate some things and why we underestimate other things.
Exactly. And that is kind of the book. So could you just give us just your book in a nutshell? Because you've written the book, it's called Why We're Wrong About Nearly Everything, A Theory of Human Misunderstanding. Could you just tell us about, like, what is the book about, just in a nutshell?
It's incredibly simple as a concept. It's all we do is we run surveys in lots of different countries, and we ask people to guess at a range of social and political realities for their country. So everything from immigration levels to murder rates, to teenage pregnancy, to obesity levels, a whole range of social issues. There's about 50 or 60. of these social issues. And then we compare it against the actual realities and look at the gap between the two in order to understand the types of biases that we're subject to. And I guess the overlying argument of the whole book is the reason that we get so many things so wrong is a combination of effects between how we think, those biases, those shortcuts that lead us astray, but also what we're told. So there's basically these two buckets of effects that are how our brains work, as well as what information we're given by the media, politicians, social media. And in the end, we're so wrong because of an interaction between those two effects that it's a system. It's a system that leads us astray. It's not just the media's fault or politicians' fault for lying to us or misleading us. And it's not just our brain's fault for having these biases and heuristics. It is the combination of those two things feeding off each other that gives us this wrong, often very wrong view of reality.
Right, but so you would say that the biggest two things are our brain and our biases because of our brain, and it's about the information that we're getting from media. Would you say that those are the two big ones?
Yeah, and I mean information in the broadest sense. This isn't stats and figures. This is stories and anecdotes. We're very driven by vivid, emotional stories. So our brains are naturally drawn to those. So they take up more weight. So even if something is unusual, rare, if it's very vivid, it sticks in our brains. And that's no accident. This is the media give us those stories because they know we're attracted to them as humans. And it's those interactions. This isn't just about politicians deliberately using the wrong figures, to the wrong statistics to mislead us. This is much more about the storytelling and our emotional reaction to things than just misremembering facts or being lied to about facts.
Right. So it's a lot about us being more interested or more inclined to be interested in emotional stories and information that is like emotional information, kind of.
Yeah, that's right. So that's in order to understand how we see the world, we need to understand the key role of emotions, identity, values, our existing world views, color how we take on new information and update our view of the world. We're not like a empty vessel that you can just fill full of facts and suddenly everyone will be accurate about things. That's not how humans work.
Right. Could you give some examples of like things we are wrong about?
Yes, there's lots.
Just pick some.
Yeah, there are very many of these things across all sorts of different issues. So one of the classic ones across lots of countries is overestimation of things like teenage pregnancy and teenage birth. So if you're asking people what percentage of women and girls aged 15 to 19 in your country do you think give birth each year, every single country overestimates. It's a very rare occurrence these days, teenage births. The average across the 30-odd countries that we asked this in was 2% across all of these different sort of countries. But the average guess was 23%, that nearly a quarter teenage girls and women were giving birth each year. And when you think about that for even a short amount of time, sort of properly engaging your brain in it, the idea that a quarter of girls in a school are giving birth every single year is just crazy. It just doesn't make sense, and it's related to one of the key effects that we explore in the book, which the social psychologists call emotional innumeracy. And that just means that our view of reality, how much we worry about something, affects our view of the scale of it, how big it is as an issue, as much as the other way round. So cause and effect run in both directions. We overestimate what we worry about as much as worrying about what we overestimate, if you see what I mean. So you've got this two-way effect of it gets inflated in our brains because we think of it as an issue. We think of it as an issue because it's a very emotional story about someone that's very young giving birth, and it kind of sticks with us. Right. And it kind of illustrates that first effect is because the media know that we're interested in those vivid, unusual stories, they tend to cover them more than the boring and mundane ones. I mean, you just wouldn't see a headline of, teenager just getting on with stuff. You wouldn't want to read about that. So the editors don't give it to us. So they give us the more vivid, unusual stories that we like. And that reinforces this feeling that it's more common than it really is.
Right. And when you say that we overestimate things that we worry about, so that basically means that things that we are afraid of, or things that we are afraid that might happen, or all of those kinds of things, it's more likely that we overestimate those kinds of things. So another example would be murder, for example, perhaps, or those kinds of things that we're worried about murder, and because of that we overestimate how many people are murdered in our country.
That's right, exactly those types of effects. So there's a lot of great social psychology experiments that show how we treat negative information differently to positive information. There's a great series of experiments by a US professor called John Cacioppo, who showed people images that were positive, sort of happy images, like, in his case, it was pizzas and Ferraris. Were
the dream life.
The dream life is pizza and Ferraris. That was a very positive reaction from people's brains. And then negative images like mutilated faces and dead cats. And what that showed was that the brain lit up in different places and with greater intensity with the negative images. And this isn't like a dumb, accidental element of our brain. This is built into us from evolution, in the sense of, in cave people days, negative information was often more urgent information that needed to be acted on, like a threat, of the classic example of a lurking saber-toothed tiger. If you didn't take notice of that type of information, you were edited out of the gene pool. So we have got a long evolutionary history of taking more notice of negative information. We're very successful as a species on the basis of being very alive to threats. So that different processing of negative information has huge benefits, but it also does make us think things are worse than they are, because the information that we focus on most is the negative, not so much the positive.
Right. So it's both that we focus more. If we have, two different stimuli, like a seemingly dead cat or a dead cat and a pizza, then the pizza creates less of an effect than the cat. So we remember, or we focus more on the cat.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And there's a second effect on things like teenage pregnancy and murder rates, which is we're also very poor at spotting slow, gradual improvements in things, partly because it doesn't make the news. It doesn't make it into newspapers. You get incremental, slow improvements in things like, teenage pregnancy has more than halved in the past 20 odd years in lots and lots of countries in Europe and the US. It's going down as a trend. but you wouldn't notice that. It wouldn't really doesn't get reported very much because it's year on year decreases, and it's sort of the same sort of points that the great Hans Rosling and his colleagues made from Sweden, and Steven Pinker makes from Canada, and Max Rosa in Britain, that we don't really notice things getting better when it's in that slow, gradual improvement way. Instead, we notice the sudden negative changes.
Right, and that also, as you talked about before, I mean, if we look at the media, it's a lot easier to grab somebody's attention with things that really are going badly, instead of like, yeah, we can see that this year we lowered the, I don't know, something by like 1% or 2%. It's quite. You understand that. I mean, we understand why. I mean, media and other information sources use those kind of tactics, because that's something that we're interested in.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's the challenge with just blaming one side of that equation of it's both how we think and what we're told. Is if you say the media are creating this because they only focus on the disasters and not the improvements, then it misses the point that that's actually also what we're drawn to.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what we want to see. I mean, what that doesn't mean though is that the media have no responsibility for giving a balanced view of the world, and that is and politicians and social media. That does not let them off the hook entirely on playing with these biases that we have in order to promote a particular view of the world, whether that's good or bad. And I mean, I think one of the key risks is that sense of everything is going downhill. What that does is it leaves space for people to say, the system isn't working at all.
Yeah,
we just need to rip it all up and start again, and that kind of falls into a trap of becoming self-fulfilling. Because the more you talk about that, the more you give that impression, the more people think, actually, yes, that's right. We've achieved nothing. We may as well rip it all up.
Yeah, exactly. And that is something also that we see. Perhaps more. I'm not sure. I think you know more than me about this, but that we see perhaps more now, like in the recent years than before, perhaps. Or what would you say about that?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it is. I did try in the book to look back as far as I could to similar sorts of questions and in history, and there is a tradition of similar questions in the US. Going back to the 1940s and 1950s, not quite the same. They do ask some similar questions around unemployment rates, which, again, like lots of these trends, people massively overestimate unemployment rates in countries. So it's around 6%, depending on the country. You quite often get average guesses of people saying 35% are unemployed. But that was the same in 1940s, 1950s America as it is today. So there is a stability in these misperceptions that means that it's not entirely clear that we are getting worse at this because social media, the media, is giving us more exaggerated views. I think it's definitely the case, and talk about this quite a bit in the book, about the information environment is getting more difficult for people to navigate because there's just much more of it, and it's much more partisan, particularly social media. You're thinking of it, some elements of the media as well, that those boundaries are getting more blurred over time. So it is getting more difficult for people. But whether that creates a more incorrect view of the world, it's not clear from the evidence that's the case. What does seem to be at least an element of this is that it could be having an effect on increasing polarization between people. It's not so much that you have a more exaggerated view of the world. It's just more that you're certain that your side is correct and the other side is wrong.
Right.
So we have seen rising identity politics across different countries, where it's more about I'm on this side, you're on that side, and that's the risk, is the extent to which our misperceptions feed into this polarization.
Exactly, and I'm not sure about this either, but I mean, it seems like we are getting a lot more information from social media and Facebook and the like now than we have before, and I mean, and this is also something that I've heard from various places that I mean, Facebook and other social media companies, they give you basically what you want. I mean, they give you what will make you stay longer and interact more with the page. So
yes, yeah, that's exactly right. So one of the key biases that we look at in the book is confirmation bias. So the broader set of effects in social psychology is called directionally motivated reasoning, which just means that you effectively look to find things that confirm your existing views, and you try to avoid or denigrate things that contradict your views.
Could you just give an example of that, just so the listeners understand?
Sure. I mean, this is a very old effect of, but if you take an example from the US, we asked one question on what kills more people in the US in terms of interpersonal violence. So that's, person-on-person violence, not suicide. Is it knives, guns, or other violence?
Yeah.
And it's, by some distance in the US, it's guns. It's 68% of all interpersonal violent deaths in the US are caused by guns, which is second only to Mexico, which is 76%. So it's very high.
Yeah, quite a lot, yeah.
And when you look at the guesses from people, the people on average are not too bad. It's 59% of people across America think that it's guns. As a Brit from a country that doesn't have gun culture, we think, God, everyone should know it's guns. But the reason that it's 59% is that there's this enormous difference between Democrats and Republicans' views of this. So 83% of strongly identifying Democrats correctly say it's guns, but it goes down to 27% of strong Republicans. Only 27% of strong Republicans think it's guns. So you've got the same social reality seen entirely differently depending on your existing political views. So that's an example of confirmation bias, directly motivated reasoning, because effectively people are looking for evidence that confirms their views and ignoring evidence that goes against their views, because it's really tightly tied up with their existing political identity.
Right. So basically, if you're a hardcore Republican, then you want your guns, and then you don't believe that the murders are by guns, and vice versa.
Yeah. And you will try and get away from any information that gives that impression, and you'll look for little bits of confirmation which when we were looking at this research, it's quite easy to find online on Twitter or Facebook. Statements and fake statistics for the US that says that it's knives are the greatest killer, and it's just not true.
It's quite interesting. Also, I've been there's something new called something called the carnivore diet. Have you heard about it?
No.
No, it's like a diet where people, the diet is basically purely eating meat.
Oh wow!
And then and it's quite interesting to see. I've been looking at an Instagram of a carnivore diet person, and it's quite interesting there that it's, all the information there is that meat is good and vegetables is not as good. Not entirely, but I mean that is the theme. And if you look at somebody who's some people that are not eating meat, then probably the information looks quite different. So yeah, so I think that's probably also a good example of this, that and that you feed yourself with the information that confirms what you already believe, and then the belief probably also gets stronger.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly it. And I mean, it's a very, very old effect. Francis Bacon wrote about it hundreds of years ago, that it is so deeply embedded in human nature that we hold on to our opinions. And there's a really, I think one of the most useful concepts is something called cognitive dissonance, which is where you get something that contradicts your view. It causes you emotional, psychological distress because it's embedded in your worldview, and you try to avoid it until it reaches a tipping point where actually it's easier to change your view than hold on to it.
Right.
But you need to get to that tipping point with people, and it's kind of people avoid it. So going back to your issue about the social media platforms, that's exactly what they are dealing with, is confirmation bias is built into their business model, because giving us more of what we already like means we're going to spend more time on those platforms. Mixing up our view of the world actually causes us some elements of distress and means we click away faster. It's kind of simple in terms of a model. And I don't think we really, when we had a kind of optimistic vision of the internet more generally and social media in particular about connecting people, we hadn't really thought through the human biases that would then feed into it. It was very kind of Panglossian sort of only optimistic and positive view of how this would work in practice, and it's just ignored the human in it, which is a big lesson.
Yeah, I mean it's quite interesting how we are like walking around on the same earth and like living in our own universes, kind of depending on depending on group, like countries, but also of course which groups you are who you are part of in your country, and what age you are, and etc. So yeah, it's quite fascinating also.
Yeah, I mean there's a great example of that in the book. On we asked people what proportion of your country has a Facebook account. The proportion of people aged 13 and over have a Facebook account. And the interesting one was India, because it was in India at the time of the study, it was about 1 in 5 people had a Facebook account, about 20%.
Right.
But the average guess in India from among our sample was 64% of people.
64%?
64 they thought.
Whoa.
But that's because all these surveys are done online. So they're only representative in India. They're only representative of people who have got internet access themselves. So it's more of a middle class, more affluent Indian group. So that middle class, internet connected Indian group that we're interviewing are more likely to have a Facebook account themselves. Their friends and family are more likely to have a Facebook account themselves. So they generalize from their own experience to the whole of India massively incorrectly. It's a really powerful social norm effect called what we see is all there is effect in the social psychology. And it's one of the things that leads us most astray, because we think we're normal when we're not really that normal. So that seems like a bit of a flaw in the study, that we're only interviewing online people. Actually, in revealing how these different groups see the world incredibly incorrectly, it's very useful. And it's actually really important in that context, because if this emerging middle class in India are unaware of quite how rare internet access is among the Indian population overall, they're much less likely to push for improved access, much more likely to just for services to be provided online only and exclude large parts of the population. There's kind of our perceptions of our misperceptions of these realities can have important consequences.
Yeah, for sure. So what is this called? So is this called what we think
what we see is all there is?
In a nutshell, that is basically that the world, or that we think that the world is like our lives are, kind of.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a group of effects. There's another effect called pluralistic ignorance, which is what we think the norm is. So we think it's when we're trying to guess what other people think or do. And there's lots of examples of that pluralistic ignorance where we think we've got the correct view of other people's opinions or behaviors, but it's actually very wrong. So you get all sorts of things, like, again, quite damaging, some of them, where even in Sweden, actually, they've got very high electoral turnout, voting levels in Swedish elections.
What?
Very high voting levels in elections.
Yeah.
85% or something similar. But you underestimate it in Sweden. People don't think it's as common as it actually is. And this is a problem, because if you don't think voting is as common as it is, you're less likely to be motivated to do it yourself. I think there is a very strong herding instinct in humans where we follow what we think of as the norm. So when we've got the norm wrong, that's important. We've got the wrong idea of that. It's the same sort of thing, actually, with the acceptability of homosexuality to people. People think it's much less acceptable in the population as a whole than it actually is. So They think that other people have more of a problem with it than they actually do. And again, it's really important for setting the tone. If you think people are more uncertain or less relaxed about it, it kind of changes people's own views of things. So we need to, that understanding what we get wrong in what other people think and do is really important as well.
Yeah, that is quite interesting. So what we believe that everybody else believes shapes our own behavior.
That's right. Through this herding approach. And it's kind of, there's a very important one on obesity, which is, there's an incredible level of obesity in lots of countries around the world, but we underestimate it. So we don't realize how fat we are, and that's important because, again, if we haven't identified it as a key problem, we're less likely to act on it. And that is a similar sort of effect of, there's lots of experiments that show even people that have very high levels of obesity often don't think of themselves as obese. So there's a morbidly obese, extremely obese category that that have been assessed by doctors, but when they were asked themselves whether they consider themselves to be obese, only 40% of people said that they were, even though they definitely were clinically assessed as obese. So we don't see ourselves as obese. We know that people tend to congregate around a friend and network group that is a similar kind of level of obesity to themselves. So we don't think ourselves, we're obese. We don't think our friends and family obese, and then we generalize from that to thinking it's much less of a problem than it actually is in lots and lots of countries.
Because that is also something that I find quite interesting. So there's a lot of things that we get wrong about murder rates, for example, and other things. But there's also seems that there are a lot of bad things that we also get wrong. For example, I saw one question about the environment, that like how many of the last 18 years that's been the hottest since we started measuring it 1961, I think it was.
Yeah.
And that is something that a lot of us got wrong, where like 17 of the 18 last years have been the hottest, but we thought, I don't know, the average answer was like 9 or something. I can't remember exactly, but
that's right.
But why do you think that is? Why do you think that some of these big problems that we have, that we underestimate them?
Yes, it's a really good question on climate change's. Nearly all of the effects in the book are things that we think are worse than they are. There's only a handful of ones where we're not aware of how serious they really are. Obesity is one, but climate change is the big one, where we still haven't quite got the message about just how serious it is, or how unusual the times that we're living through right now are in a climate sense. And it's kind of, there's a bit double-edged, this one. This is a really interesting area, I think, because while we are not very accurate, not completely accurate in how serious it is, there is a strong school of thoughts within climate change campaigning and communication that we need to be careful not to overdo the catastrophic nature or potential of the situation, because if people think it's all lost, they are not motivated to act. So there was a great book by David Wallace Wells called Uninhabitable Earth, where he took all the kind of doomsday predictions from all the different areas, all the worst case scenarios, really, and put them all in one place. And when he first wrote about that 2 or 3 years ago, there was a lot of climate change campaigns that were saying this is worse than climate denial, because it makes it all sound so impossible to deal with, and people need a sense that we can achieve something, and it's not all lost. And it's a really interesting debate and point about how much fear, how much accurate knowledge of the scale of the challenge and fear is good for action, to encourage action. And I don't think we have the answer to that. We had, and it's kind of summed up a bit in schools of thought about fear is a good motivator, schools of thought that hope is a good. So it's a kind of fear versus hope. One thing that's clear from the experiments in all sorts of different spheres is that people need to have some sense of efficacy, that they can have an effect on things. And I think climate change has a particular issue with that, obviously, because any of our individual actions are not going to make any difference to something so truly global. So we are reliant on everyone acting, and that gets really tough for people to get their heads around, that I can't actually contribute very much at all because I'm reliant on everyone else contributing in order to make that happen. And I think that is one of the big challenges in communicating this, because what it means is that people switch off from, they got an idea that there's an issue, and definitely concern about climate change has increased in the last few years. So people are more worried about it, but they don't, apart from people who are campaigning or very interested in it, lots of other people don't like to think about it too much because it seems so big and scary. And their contribution to be able to resolve it, their efficacy, seems very low. So it's a sort of thing that you kind of worry about, but then put out of your mind as much as possible, because you can't really act on it.
Right. So it's some kind of I don't know what you should call it, but yeah, when problems become too big, you don't want to think about them. Effect.
Yeah. So it's that you do have a sort of ostrich-like element to it, where you just hope it goes away, because we see similar things when people they don't want to think about their pension planning or their social care, because not just because it's boring, but because it kind of brings home thoughts of death, and
right.
So you don't really like to think of yourself as old and in need of that type of help. So there's big challenges in getting people to face up to their future in retirement or needing health and social care, just because it's not a pleasant thing to think about.
Right. So it's perhaps that when hard topics are topics that creates a lot of feelings, negative feelings in us, those that we perhaps avoid them if they if they have too much of an effect on us.
Yeah, I mean, combined with that sense of we've got no efficacy here, we've got no ability to shape this ourselves. There's an inevitability of climate change. There's an inevitability, I cannot control that on my own. And there's an inevitability of getting old and dying that you can't do an awful lot about. So, yes, those types of things. It's also what's in our control is important as well.
So So we've been discussing a couple of very interesting biases that we seem to have. If we just start off with the first one, like the emotional innumeracy one, which basically that we focus on things that are negative more than on the positive, and it also creates more in us. Like what can we do in order to mitigate this bias?
Yeah, it's like I kind of go back to Daniel Kahneman's point about he's been doing this for 40 odd years and he hasn't improved one bit. And what he actually
are we all doomed already?
There's a bit of that. But what he went on to say in that interview was what he meant was that you can't control your system one thinking, which is what he calls fast thinking, your kind of emotional, immediate mental shortcut type response. You can't deny that is going to happen in any case. You're going to have those effects. What you can do sometimes, to some degree, is to get your system to slower, more considered thinking to kick in when you're thinking about issues. So a lot of the tips at an individual level are about that. Can you recognize the biases that you're likely to be subject to, and counter them through that more deliberate thought? So, I mean, it is things like, in the book, there's 10 things that we can do, and half of them are those mental shortcuts, changing our mental shortcuts to start to think most things are getting better, not worse, which is the reality. Not everything, but if you start from that point, then you are more likely to be correct than starting from thinking everything is going downhill. Avoiding thinking you're utterly normal, just questioning whether you're representative of things, but then also being very aware that we're drawn to extreme examples, that we will naturally pick out vivid, unusual things and generalize from those just because we're attracted to them more. So actually be careful not to base your judgments on things that you remember easily, because they're usually the things that are more vivid. So there's those types of effects that we can do. And then, I mean, the other half of the actions that we can take are much more systemic around actually, where our information environment has been more polluted over recent years, and really it's not sustainable to have a system like this where the platforms are so built into their system, their model, to be motivated to just give us more of what we want without challenge, and that there are particular circumstances, say around general elections in political elections in countries, where we need to be extra careful about how that information is being used. I mean, in the UK and the US, there are less controls on information that is spread online, campaigning messages that are spread online by political parties and others, than there is in the newspapers or through leaflets or whatever. There's much more rigor and control offline than online, when online has become the key campaigning arena. So our legislation, our regulations just haven't kept up with the technology and how information has changed. So we're a long way behind, and we just need to catch up on how does this type of new model of information provision, how do we regulate it? and control it, and particularly around key events where people are making big decisions like elections.
But so the first one there is basically that you said that it's good to just know about these biases, to know that things are actually not as bad as we intuitively think. Just to know that is one of the things that might help us.
Yes, exactly. I think just keeping that in mind is really useful, and I think there is some psychological health benefits from that as well. It is a bit like therapy in some ways, where you kind of teach yourself to not just focus on the negative. It's like cognitive behavioral therapy, if you can notice the patterns in your thinking that makes you too negative or brings you down, then that's a key way to understand how to avoid it. In that kind of cognitive behavioral therapy, there's a lot of just writing down what your thought processes are. And it's similar in this kind of real world examples, although, to be, realistic on what people will do day to day, you can't expect people to be doing that all the time and be trying to be perfectly rational human beings, because that's not how it works. But having a bit more of it is feasible.
So you mentioned that it's about knowing about these biases. What was the other one? The second one, that we are not normal, right?
Yeah, that we have a tendency to generalize from our own views and our own direct experience to think that is the norm. I mean, the one that's really important that's related to the negative one is rosy retrospection. It's called, which means more or less what you think it means, of just looking at the past in a more rosy way. And that was, again, there was a great series of experiments by a US professor called Terence Mitchell, who followed people before, during, and after their holidays, their vacation, and just interviewed them. And then continue to interview them over time afterwards. And that showed we go in this pretty standard average pattern of you go from excited anticipation before you go, you get on holiday, and there's the reality of minor niggles, things go wrong, small things go wrong, and it's not as good as you hoped, you anticipated. And then you return with a sense of mild disappointment when you're back, and it's not as perfect as you'd hoped. But then he kept interviewing. That wasn't really the purpose of the experiment. He kept interviewing people for a long time afterwards, and that was the purpose, was to see over time what happened was people literally forgot the bad bits and only remembered the good bits from their holidays. So you would forget the kids being sick in the car, and you would just remember the lovely walks on the beach. And that is, again, not a dumb fault of our brain. It's quite good to let go of those minor niggles and just remember the good times for our own psychological health. But it also makes us think that the present and future are worse than they are because we think the past was better than it was. And that is a key element of thinking that things are going downhill, and it's a key threat for people who want to rip up the system, actually getting their way. So that's a really important one, to just that idea of fighting that idea that everything is going downhill is a really key thing that we can do as individuals.
For sure. And I mean, the spreading of the information about your book and about these biases also, I mean, it's probably has an effect of people, that they will start understanding that it's probably not as bad as it all seems.
Yeah, well, I really hope so. That would be amazing.
Yeah.
It is the problem is some people misinterpret the Rosling Pinker Max Rosa view that's trying to say, remember, lots of things are getting better, is being complacent. And but actually, the much bigger risk is not complacency. It's not saying that everything is perfect. The much bigger risk is thinking that things are worse than they really are. And I think particularly right now, in all sorts of political situations in Sweden, in the UK, in the US, there are plenty of people who are trying to play on that sense to for their own political ends. And that seems to me to be the much bigger immediate risk.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is as like we discussed. If everybody is thinking that society is going down the drain, then that creates more motivation for us to look for something to fix the problem.
Yeah, that's right. Through any means necessary, and it's kind of, you end up throwing away a lot of good stuff. So I mean, that fighting that sense is one of the most important. And tough for humans to do, and particularly when it interacts with politics and media, who have vested interests in pushing a particular worldview at us.
Right. Do you think that this is one of the biggest problems when it comes to elections and campaigning?
Yeah, I mean, it is. Again, it's sort of like your very good questions about, so is this different from the past? It's always been like this in politics, that you will get one side saying, things are getting terrible, we need to try something entirely different. I think there is a difference now from that polarization point of view, is that we can live our lives more separately in terms of what information we see in our filter bubbles. They having been able to pick and choose what information we see much more, having unseen algorithms doing that for us by pushing things they know we will like, does change the capability of having different parts of the population with entirely different views of reality. Because it's just easier to do that now when in this sort of environment, where decades ago we didn't have this variety of different outlets. And then, I mean, you get into the properly scary potential from the technology, where if you combine the capability to do very micro-targeted messaging, which we have now, and the Cambridge Analytica experience in the UK and the US was an example of that. So you've got a micro-targeting capability. You've also got a AI, artificial intelligence capability, which means that you can test different communications at an enormous scale. So there was 100,000 variations on political adverts a day in the US.
Wow.
So you can just do these little tiny tweaks and test it and see which one works best. And if you've got a third element of deep fake videos, which are these very convincing videos where you can make someone look like, or just type in the words and get Donald Trump to say whichever word you're typing in, then not so much as a fake, but as a campaign tool. You can imagine how you could have Donald Trump as part of the official campaign, and not any politician as part of their official campaign, being used by their own campaign team to just say something directly to you that is entirely different to what he's saying to me.
Wow.
And then we have no common understanding of what these political messages are. So we're at the point where those things are feasible. We're already seeing examples of each element. It's when they all come together that it's the worry.
Now that is very interesting. So Yeah, exactly. So you can basically just tailor the message to everybody, and to really to so then it becomes more like who is the best at this type of marketing, kind of.
Yes.
If it is that, if it will be that effective and successful, it's more that it won't be, yeah, it will more be who is the best at this type of marketing rather than who has the best ideas.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not exactly like that, of course, but one part of the entire campaign.
Right. I think, look, there is controversy over how effective this micro-targeting communication actually is. Some people say it is, some people say actually it doesn't change that much. I think the counter-argument to that was that it didn't take that much to change big votes, like the US election or the Brexit vote in the UK. They were very close votes. So it's not actually, don't have to shift millions and millions of people. You just have to shift a few.
But is this something that has been used in some, not as advanced way in because there's been a lot of, I don't know so much about this, but there's been a lot of talk about Russia being involved in the US election. Is this has this something to do with that, or?
Yeah, I think we did a report here actually from a Policy Institute at King's, which is where I'm based, point of view on the Skripal poisoning that we had in the UK, which was a Russian citizen who was killed by poisoning in the UK by allegedly Russia. But what the state news organizations, what this research showed the state news organizations did, was not so much try to push a particular line as to push dozens of different lines and explanations to just create confusion. So there was 130 different interpretations of what's actually happened put out by Russia Today and Sputnik in the course of 2 weeks, I think it was. So there's just these kind of related to the bigger point of quite often the attempt is not to convince you one way or the other, but just to confuse people. And so that people don't know what's real and what isn't.
Right.
And that's the kind of, so there's all sorts of potential in these. That is not all about who is convincing you one way or the other, as opposed to who is just destabilizing the whole system.
So it's kind of political warfare.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's sort of, that's the Russian Minister of Defense has said explicitly that information is a new type of warfare. Well, it's always been a type of warfare. There's always been propaganda and things, but just the scale of it is very different now.
Wow, I think we could go on and on about this, because I think I find this very, very interesting. But I know that everything good comes to an end, and and it's time for us to close down the recording. But it's been really fascinating, and I would like to give you a big thanks for coming on and talking about this, because this is, as we just talked about now in the end, I think it is something that becomes even more important as time goes by. So big thank you for coming on and talking about this.
No problem at all. Loved it. It was great to talk to you.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Friends, I really need your help. I'm trying to get the podcast out there. So I was wondering if you could help me by leaving a positive rating and a review on your Apple device or the podcast player that you're using, as well as subscribing to the podcast. That really helps getting the show more visible on iTunes and other players. And if you don't know how it's done, then YouTube has a lot of great videos, so you can search there. All right, that's it. Take care.